Good day. So today's video is about soil science. Okay, so first of all, this will be in your books from pages 98 to 121. Don't worry, I know it's off pages. I will make more than one video about this topic. Okay, so first of all, let's look at the functions of soil. Why should we even bother knowing what is in soil and what is the uses of soil and why is soil important to us? So primarily, which we already know, is that with soil, plants can grow and the animals can eat the plants, and we as humans can enjoy either eating the plants or the animals for food. So it is very necessary for us to survive, actually. Then with carbon dioxide, it regulates it because carbon dioxide is produced by plants and it can also be fixated into the soil. It goes into the soil and is also used there for other organisms that live inside the soil. And it's also there for purification reasons. So with the soil, the water going through the soil, it actually purifies the water, and by the time it gets to the river system, it'll actually be pure water, and we'll be able to drink this. Okay, this is now, not considering the fact that pollution is happening. So in a world where there is no pollution, the soil will actually be able to filter the water, and the water will be very clean. Also, it regulates our climate. Some of the heat from the sun gets, I don't say bounces off the surface of the soil, so that the rest of the earth where we live is not so hot. Okay, so underneath the soil, the temperature is actually much lower than in the atmosphere. It also is important for the nutrient cycling. So inside the soil there's other nutrients such as sodium, potassium, all that, and for the cycling specific things like nitrogen that is expelled from manure and so on from cattle or any other animals. So it's also fixated inside the soil, it gets released back into the atmosphere and so on. Also important for as a habitat for organisms. So your large organisms such as earthworms and moles and things live inside the soil because it's much cooler down there. And also other organisms, microorganisms, such as nematodes, which are a type of small worms, and also other parasites and things live inside the soil. And also for flood regulation, to ensure that everything doesn't flood away, the soil actually absorbs some of the water and takes it back to the river system. And it's also important for things like for infrastructure. We build bridges on it, we build buildings onto it, and we also use it to make construction materials such as concrete, which is basically water, soil, rocks, and sometimes salt, among other things. And it's also important as a cultural heritage, for our cultural heritage, such as with archaeology and so on, they've actually found ancient civilizations where the cities have been covered by years and years of soil deposition. So they discover all these fascinating history things underneath the soil, which tells us about our ancestry and can tell us about how the world, all the people living on Earth, how they evolved and how technology increased and so on. Okay, so basically soil is, well, in this case, like a memory capsule. So it is important for the Earth and for society in general. Okay, then we look at the components of soil. There are primarily four components. First of all, your mineral, then organic things like humus and manure and things from animals, your organic pieces. Then we have water. There is water in the soil, as I mentioned, and there is also air within the soil called pore spaces. Okay, so let's look at the mineral components. Your mineral components, your particles are formed when hard rock and minerals weathers. Weathers is when rocks break down into smaller pieces. So mineral particles consist of small stones, also gravel, sand, silt, and even clay. Okay, so within or amongst these mineral particles, there are also pore spaces, which is your air spaces. Then if we look at, about a mineral makes up 45% of the soil, and your organic pieces is only a small chunk of this pie, so it's about 5%. So your organic matter consists of dead and decaying plant and animal matter. So it will also be dead animals, dead plants, and so on, and also the feces of animals. So the organic matter is digested by macroorganisms. These are your large organisms like your moles. You can physically see them, and also your microorganisms in the soil. They break down all these particles, organic particles, and make them into smaller pieces. So your organic material is very beneficial because it's a good source of certain gases like nitrogen, and also it improves the soil's capacity to retain water. So some of this, it enables there to be water in the soil, and this is important for plants because they need to absorb they need to absorb water to be able to survive. Okay, so the water component makes up about 20 to 30% inside the soil, depends on the type of soil you're working on. So your water component, we look at it, it can be divided into three sections. Okay, there's three types of soil water. First of all, there's hygroscopic water. Now this is found around the soil particles. They are very strongly attracted to the soil particles. It's like they cling onto the soil particles. Okay, so they can't be absorbed by plants. They stick to the pieces of soil like glue. Now around the soil pieces. Now, then you have capillary water. So capillary, the word should make you think about water moving. Okay, so this type of water is available for plants to absorb. Then thirdly, if you're gravitational water, gravitational, it sounds like gravity, so that's what it refers to. Water is water that moves into, then through the soil, and then out of the soil based on gravity. Okay, so it's on the top of the soil, moves through the soil, and then based on gravity, it filters from top to bottom until it leaves the soil, or there's a thing called a water table underneath the soil, deep down in the deeper layers of soil, and then it drips down and goes into the water, or forms part of the water table, and then eventually it goes to the river system. Okay, then looking at our soil air, so the soil air is about 20 to 30% of, and remember this is in the soil, not in the atmosphere. And it's not just made out of oxygen, it's also carbon dioxide and nitrogen gas. And also, just take note, in poorly aerated soil, so soil that doesn't have enough air spaces in it, the concentration of carbon dioxide would be much higher. And this can also be toxic for certain plant species. So it's good to have a good nitrogen to oxygen to carbon dioxide ratio within the different soils. Okay, then we move on to primary minerals. You get primary and you get secondary minerals. So your primary minerals are made up of your basic mineral components, such as things like magnesium, oxygen, phosphorus, potassium, silicon, and sodium. This is what all the minerals are made out of. This is the building blocks of minerals. So how the minerals are formed, or the rocks, it comes from rocks. So your rocks undergo weathering, the physical breakdown of the rock, to become soil. And this means that soils consist of the same minerals as rock. Okay, so how is your primary minerals formed? Just to give you an idea. So they are formed deep within, usually within a volcano, under high temperature and pressure. I mean, you can imagine how hot it is inside a volcano. So it's very hot, and the pressure from all that magma is so immense. It's like within this, in Afrikaans we say a skoorsteen. It's within this, oh, sorry, my English sucks today. Chimney, sorry, it's within this chimney. So it's a small space, it's almost like a tube, so the pressure is very, very immense. Okay, so also within the absence of oxygen. So oxygen is usually not present within this volcano, and under this magma forms, it becomes liquid, and this is your primary minerals. They undergo this change within them, and then they usually become something called igneous rock. We will look at this at a later stage. So some examples of primary minerals will be things like augite, muscovite, quartz. I think most of you have heard about quartz. So some in your books you can look at more detail about what are the different characteristics of these different primary minerals, but you have to be able to mention a few primary minerals. So know quartz is very easy to know this is one of the primary minerals, and something like muscovite is also easy to remember. It's also called mica. So just to mention, muscovite, it releases potassium, magnesium, and iron. So this is what it's made out of. Um, as I mentioned, it's potassium, magnesium, and iron I did not put here. But anyways, the basic minerals this muscovite consists of. And your quartz is actually, it does not, it's a very hard and clear crystal. And it cannot actually weather into other smaller types of minerals. This is actually the simplest form quartz can be in. And it does not dissolve in water. Okay, so then moving on to our secondary minerals. Secondary minerals are made from the primary minerals. Okay, so they are formed when primary minerals undergo chemical weathering, so they are broken down chemically, or where the structure of the primary mineral changes in a chemical reaction. Okay, so they change their form. Then they are also formed at low temperatures and pressure, whereas the primary are formed at high temperature and high pressure. These guys are formed at low temperature and low pressure. You'd think that they are formed over a long period of time as well, because the heat and pressure is so low. Okay, here are a few examples of them. As I mentioned, you get something called igneous rock. You also get sedimentary rocks and metamorphic rocks. They are the three types of secondary minerals. Again, here are a few examples of each. Something like diorite is igneous rock, and granite, I think most of you have heard of that. Then sandstone, shale, limestone, also dolomite are sedimentary rocks. And quartzite and marble, and I think some of you have heard of slate, is metamorphic rocks. Okay, just to mention, I think it was dolomite. It's a very interesting type of rock. They are formed out of calcium and magnesium, and this is why they actually look so kind of see-through-ish, magnesium and calcium. Okay, I don't think you have to know all the physical properties of each mineral in much detail, but as I mentioned, be able to name a few of these minerals. Okay, then we're looking at differences between our primary and secondary minerals. This is very important. So as I mentioned, primary minerals are formed under high temperature and pressure without oxygen. It's formed with magma, very hot within a volcano. When the magma erupts outside of a volcano and it reaches the surface of the earth, it crystallizes. It cools down, so then it crystallizes and forms igneous rock. Okay, and the structure of these primary minerals are kind of sandy and silty. Okay, but then your secondary minerals, they are formed under low temperature and pressure and with oxygen. Usually this happens on the surface of the soil, but with your igneous rock, other types of rocks can form underneath the soil layers, but it is within the presence of oxygen. Then this forms when primary rocks or primary minerals goes through a process called weathering or reprecipitation. So the weathering is the physical breakdown of your primary minerals, and the reprecipitation is when this primary mineral has been broken down into smaller pieces and they reform. So reprecipitation, a simpler way of thinking of it is meaning it reforms into a new type of rock. So reforms. Then also this type of mineral is really clayish, clay-like. Okay, so the texture and everything makes you think of clay, whereas the primary minerals are more sandy or salty. Okay, so how do we identify these different types of minerals? There's a whole lot of type of characteristics people look at when they try and classify these, but the primary ones that you have to take note of is firstly color. Yeah, basically the type of color it is, like your darker type rocks would be your igneous rocks, Your more pinkish type colors, which make you think that it is a metamorphic rock. Okay, so the color shows you what type of mineral it is. Then also the hardness. Is it very soft? Is it very hard? Is it breakable? And so on. They look at that. It's also, they look at the resistance. The hardest has to do with the resistance of scratching or abrasions if you were to scratch on it, if it scratches or not. Then thirdly, they look at the luster. So your luster, it refers to the way a mineral surface interacts with light. So if you shine a light on it, does it sparkle or is it dull? What's the color of it when light shines on it? Then fourthly, they look at streaking. So streaks have to do with the color of the mineral when it is powdered. So if you were to shave off a bit of this mineral and you put it on a piece of paper, what is the color of this dust? I want to say the powder or the dust. What is the color that forms? Then also they look at the surface of the material, and surface has to do with things like cleavage and fracture. So cleavage has to do when you break it. But there are, don't know if you know what striations are, but there's kind of like these invisible lines inside the rock. So if you look closely, it looks like there's a line going that way. So cleavage has to do with whether when you break it, whether it breaks through this line or on this line, and why does it look on the inside when it is broken on the plane of this striation? What does it look like? And fracture has to do is if you break the rock against this line, so in this direction. What does the structure look like when you break it in that way, making a fracture line? What does it look like? Then another property would be chemical properties. Chemically, what's inside the rock, what's it made out of, those chemical properties of it. Then additionally, there are things like the crystal forms or the form of the rock. What does it look like? The shape basically of the mineral. What's the shape? Then things like tenacity. Tenacity has to do with how elastic is it? Is it very hard? Can you, I wouldn't say be able to bend it, but is it kind of pliable in your hand? Or is it completely hard or like glass-like? So the tenacity has to do with the toughness. How tough is this rock? Then transparency has to do with how transparent is it. Transparent is what happens when you shine a light through it. Does the light go through or does the light shine back at you? And translucent is if you can see through. Like in this picture, you can literally see the blue background through this piece of quartz or whatever it is. Then also how opaque is it? Opaque has to do with the color. So in this case, it would be a bit opaque because look how white some of the crystals are. Okay, then quickly looking at rock formation. So how does rock form? I mentioned within magma, let's say there is rock within this volcano, it melts because of heat and pressure, so that magma forms, is a liquid form of this rock. As soon as this magma cools down, you have something called igneous rock that forms on the surface. If this igneous rock for some reason melts again, if magma touches it or whatever and it melts, it turns back into magma. If it undergoes heat and pressure, it can turn into something called metamorphic rock. If it undergoes weathering and erosion, basically it breaks down into smaller pieces. If it breaks down, it becomes something called sediment. And if this sediment actually compacts, clusters, all the particles cluster together and they cement to one another, they stick like glue to one another, they form sedimentary rock. And if this undergoes again physical breakdown, it can turn back into sediment. And if the sedimentary rock actually undergoes again something like heat and pressure, it can turn into metamorphic rock. So metamorphism means changing shape. So because of this heat and pressure, it turns into metamorphic rock, and this can also turn back into sediment when it breaks down into smaller pieces. Because sediment is these physical smaller pieces of the rock. But if this metamorphic rock undergoes heat or it's melted again because of heat, it can turn back into magma. So what you guys need to understand is that soil, the shape of soil isn't permanent. Anything, certain environmental characteristics can change the shape and the chemical properties of soil. And usually this entire process, it takes a very long time for this to happen. It won't happen overnight, but with the right conditions, certain environmental conditions, the shape and everything, the properties of the soil can change. Okay, so let's take a deeper look at our igneous rock. So the igneous rock, they're different. Well, usually, like I mentioned, they're formed from molten lava. So the lava form inside the Earth's crust or inside the volcano. As soon as it erupts and it flows down on the surface of the soil, it cools down and solidifies, becomes hard rock. Okay, here are a few examples of it. There are two types of igneous rock. Okay, they mentioned here three, but two you have to know. It is intrusive and extrusive. So your intrusive igneous rock takes thousands of years to cool down. It forms over a very long time, so thousands of years to form. And it's kind of small to medium grains, but you can physically see it. But it's medium sized compared to the different sizes you get of the rock. And then extrusive, it takes seconds. So this is usually your molten lava, which just erupted from a volcano. It immediately cools down, maybe overnight, and then it solidifies. So this type of rock is invisible or microscopic. It's very hard to see the individual grains. Just for interest's sake, the plutonic type, it cools over millions of years. So this takes millennia to form, but these pieces are very large. Okay, but the ones you need to know about is intrusive and extrusive. Okay, so what are the physical properties of the igneous rock? As I mentioned, they are hard and difficult to break. And also they are usually dark or grey or dark red in color. They only have a few grey examples here, but they can be dark red as well. Again, a few examples that you can know about is gabbro, granite, obsidian. Oh, this is a very nice dark type of rock. And pumice, and I mention andesite or basalt. Okay, a few examples that you need to take note of. Then sedimentary rocks. Remember, these can be formed from igneous rocks. So when igneous rocks are being broken down into smaller pieces, what happens is these eroded pieces or smaller sediments, the small pieces, they end up in the water and they can settle into the lower layers of the river system. Okay, so these settle at the bottom of, say, a river system, and then with time, more layers come and the particles are deposited onto one another. They make like a sandwich. If the bottom part is the bread, each time a new layer of let's make it polony, comes and sits on this bread piece until the top bread piece comes onto it. Okay, basically, so it sandwiches onto one another, meaning it compacts. There is in this stage a bit of water molecules in between the soil particles. So there is water within the soil, but with even more time, as you remember, there's gravitational pressure coming through. The gravity wants to send the particles, or it attracts the particles to move down with gravity. So when this happens and they move a bit lower, but they stay here on the surface or the bottom of the river, the water is expelled from in between the sand grains. So there's less water now in between these layers. And then something called cementation happens. So salt crystals glue these layers together. They are now becoming physically a part of one another. You won't be able to separate the different sand layers. So they cement together or glue together. And then a new rock mass is formed and it's called sedimentary rock. Okay, so their properties are usually, they are the softest group of rocks, so they are very soft. And they come in many colors and shapes and so on. So a few examples is your sandstone, shale, and also mudstone. You can see they are very fine and grainy and so on. That's one of their characteristics. Then thirdly, we get metamorphic rock, as we saw in the rock cycle. So metamorphic rocks are formed when igneous or sedimentary rocks are changed by pressure or chemical reactions. Okay, here's a visual example. This is your sedimentary rock, the layers that formed on top of one another, so they cemented together, and now pressure is being exerted from the sides. And in this picture, they just literally squashed the piece of rock. So just to show you that physically it changed. Now it's with pressure and everything, all the particles are closer together. Okay, then you get metamorphic rock or metamorphic rocks. So their properties are that they have higher density. You can see they are much more dense. The pore spaces, the air spaces will be even less within this type of rock than within a sedimentary rock. And also they are very smooth. In these examples you can see they have smooth surfaces. And they are mostly pink or white. Okay, unfortunately there isn't a few pink examples here, but they do have a lot of white in them. White color striations. Again, a few examples you need to take note of is things like quartzite, slate, marble. I think most of us have heard of marble, and something called schist as well. Okay, I know a few examples. And I think that is it for now. I will make a second video.